In the previous lecture, we looked at the skeletal system. We talked about the many different types of bones that compose the body, its functions, and how the skeletal system, although it seems quite simple, is a lot more complex and impactful than we may understand. In this lecture, we'll look at the nervous system. We'll look at what the nervous system does, its functions, and break it down into neurons and the nervous system systems that allow for it to work the way it does. So, the nervous system is defined as the system that is responsible to the reactance to the stimulus internally and externally and help regulate the internal organs of the body. The nervous system can be divided into two main types of subsystems: the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is mainly composed of the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system is all the other nerves that help create the rest of the body and the nervous system. And we'll talk a little bit about the difference between these two as this section continues. So, the central nervous system, as I mentioned earlier, contains the brain and the spinal cord, and can be considered the central processing components. All of the nerves that connect to the rest of the body connect back to the spinal cord, and the spinal cord will then send all the information to the brain. The brain will then take that information from the spinal cord and send it back down through the spinal cord to the rest of the body, which will allow for the stimulus response to occur within the rest of the body. The rest of these body's nerves are considered to be the peripheral nervous system, and they consist of nerve cells and their fibers that emerge from the brain and spinal cord and communicate with the rest of the body. So, what are the nerves of the peripheral system? There are two main types of nerves within the peripheral system: the afferent and the efferent nerves. The afferent nerves are considered to be sensory nerves, and they carry nerve impulses from the sensory receptors in the body back to the central nervous systems. Then you have the efferent or the motor nerve cells, which convey the information away from the central nervous system to the effectors. So first you have the afferent or sensory nerves that detect something within the body. They take that information and run it through an electrical pulse back to the spinal cord and the brain to help give a response back. Once that response has been made within the brain, it is then sent through the efferent motor nerve cells, which will then convey that information to other parts of the central nervous system and help create a response. And that is basically the gist of what goes on within the peripheral system, as well as the rest of the nervous system. So the brain needs to be discussed, as it is the highest processing center of the nervous system and basically your entire body. So you have a couple of subdivisions within the brain that all have very specific functions. The brain stem acts as a relay, which helps exchange the messages between the spinal cord and the brain, and there's a lot of different things that can be done. It helps control the heart rate, the respiratory rate, and the blood pressure, as well as being involved in taste and hearing. The cerebrum concentrates on voluntary movements and coordinates mental activity. So if you're trying to move your body, such as walking, that's a voluntary movement. So the cerebrum is the main actuator in all of that. The diencephalon helps connect the midbrain with the cerebral hemispheres. And within its area, it has to control all of the sensory information except for smell. And it relays this information to the cerebrum. Other areas within this area as well control the autonomous nervous system, which we'll talk about earlier, which help regulate body heat, water balance, sleep-wake patterns, food intake, and behavioral responses associated with emotions. There's so much that goes on within the brain that is still being looked at and understood to this day. The brain controls almost everything we do, and we have so much information that's stored within the brain that helps understand our basic movements and functionality to learning new types of information. But in this case, the brain is the processing center of the nervous system that controls all of the movement within the body. So let's talk a little bit more about the brain. 75% of the brain is actually water, and it floats in a solution called cerebrospinal fluid. It is then encased within a 3-layer tissue called cranial meninges. The brain is very well protected against chemical-based injuries because you don't want a new type of chemical going into the brain, because this can cause permanent damage to the brain. The blood-brain barriers are the only entrance of the brain, and the capillaries is this barrier that is highly impermeable to toxic substances, which helps create a safe area for the brain. Now let's talk a little bit about the distribution of the peripheral nerves, which are the nerves that go away from the central nervous system to help create the reactions and the actions to external stimuli. The peripheral nerves are distributed from the spinal cord, just as I mentioned earlier. The vertebra or the vertebral column are separated from each other by the annular intervertebral discs, which act as shock absorbers. So therefore, if you have any sort of pressure or impact on the body, the discs help act as shock absorbers to help diffuse that pressure. Each vertebra then has a channel that the spinal nerve can leave the spinal cord. So the spinal cord mainly acts as this big area that helps relay signals and allows them to leave and come to the brain. And that is the main purpose of the vertebral column. So how does this all work? How do the nerves help convey this signal from the brain and then have it conveyed back to it so that an action can occur? The neural system consists of 100 billion nerve cells called neurons, and this is how everything is done. These neurons act as the communication channel to transmit the nervous impulses to and from the brain. To this end, the neurons must have excitability and conductivity to help conduct and allow for the signal to pass through it. Excitability means responding to a stimuli. So if it responds to a stimuli and allows it to conduct, then the neuron is very essential to the body. And conductivity means the ability to conduct the impulses. And so what is the structure of a neuron? The first thing to know is that there are dendrites within the neuron, which are shown in the graph below. The dendrites will conduct the information towards the cell body. The axon, which is this long line that connects to the axon terminals from the cell body, will then transmit the information away from the cell body to another nerve body. The myelin sheath, which are these little circles that are on the axon, are segmented and interrupted at regular intervals by gaps called neurofibril nodes. These gaps have an important function in the transmission of impulses along the axon. The thing that is important about the myelin sheath is that the myelin sheath will have these intervals, which are called the nodes of Ranvier. And with these nodes, you can allow for the signal to travel at a much faster rate. By creating this sheet that is impermeable to electrical signals, the signals will then have to jump in between these nodes. And therefore, by cutting the distance in between the myelin sheath, you're able to have a much faster response time. And that is how it works. Unmyelinated nerve members can be found in the peripheral nervous system, but unlike the myelinated fibers, they can then tend to conduct at a slower speed. As I mentioned, without the myelin sheath, the response time is a lot slower than when with the myelin sheath because it allows for a faster signal to travel to and from the neuron. So now let's talk a little bit about the autonomic nervous system, which talked a little bit earlier about when we were discussing the systems. The autonomic nervous system has the responsibility of maintaining the body's homeostasis, which is a general stability within the body without any sort of conscious effort. If you were thinking about your heart beating, breathing, pulsing your veins to allow for blood to go through, you wouldn't have time to do anything else but just focus very hard on trying to be alive. However, with the autonomic nervous system, you don't have to think about all these things, and your body can do it automatically. The autonomic nervous system helps influence the function of internal organs to help them all work, and is divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic reactions. The sympathetic division prepares the body for flight or fight reactions, and the parasympathetic division will return the body to normal operating conditions. So first you'll have the sympathetic division, which is fight or flight, which helps dilate the pupil, inhibits salivation, accelerates the heart, and facilitates breathing. It also inhibits digestion and stimulates the release of glucose, which helps create more energy. It will also secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine, relax the bladder, and inhibit the sex organs. So when you're after this flight or fight reaction, you go into the parasympathetic division, where all the different types of things are going into the opposite. So the pupil will be constricted, it'll stimulate salivation, slows down your heart, constricts breathing, stimulating digestion, stimulates the gallbladder, and contracts the bladder and stimulates the sex organ. So if you're in any sort of exercise mode, you're going to go into the sympathetic division, and then afterwards you'll go into the parasympathetic division when you're resting. And that is how the autonomic nervous system works.